Wagner chief Yevgeny Prigozhin has been listed in a Russian plane crash with no survivors. Prigozhin, who previously operated in the shadows, came into the spotlight during Russia's offensive in Ukraine, launched in February 2022. The crash comes 2 months after Prigozhin launched a short-lived rebellion, seen as the biggest challenge to the Russian President Putin's authority since he came to power. Now, Russia's Ministry for Emergency Situations on Wednesday announced that the crash of a private plane traveling between Moscow and St. Petersburg, and they said that there were no survivors of that plane crash. Meanwhile, they also said that 10 people on board died, including 3 crew members. The ministry also said that Russia's aviation agency later said that the Wagner chief was on board this plane that crashed. Meanwhile, the Russian authorities also listed Dmitry Utkin, who is a shadow figure who managed Wagner's operations and allegedly served in the Russian military intelligence, that he has also died in the plane crash. Meanwhile, Russian aviation agency said that it has set up a special investigative committee to probe the crash of the aircraft belonging to MNT Aero. Now, Russia's investigative committee, which probes serious crime, said that it has opened a probe into the crash. Now, Embraer said that it was aware of a crash in Russia which involved a Legacy 600 aircraft, but it did not have further information and had not been providing support services for the jet since 2019. The Brazilian plane maker stated that it has complied with the international sanctions imposed on Russia. Sanctions block Western aircraft manufacturers from providing parts or support for planes operated in Russia. Meanwhile, Putin was giving a speech for the 80th anniversary of the Kursk battle in World War II. He clearly did not mention the crash, and he hailed the soldiers for fighting bravely and resolutely in the special military operation in Ukraine. Now, Kyiv and Washington also reacted swiftly to initial reports of the crash. Biden told the reporters that there's not much that happens in Russia that Putin is not behind. Well, he said this while leaving a spin class in California. He said that he does not know what happened with Prigozhin and that he was not surprised by the reports. Here's what the U.S. president said. Take a listen.
I don't know for a fact what happened, but I'm not surprised.
Do you believe?
There's not much that happens in Russia that Putin's not behind, but I don't know enough to know the answer.
Meanwhile, Ukrainian presidential aide Podolsky said that the plane crash was a signal from Putin to Russia's elites ahead of the 2024 elections. And they said that, be aware, disloyalty equals to death. That's what he said. Now, the exiled leader of the opposition of Belarus said that Prigozhin would not be missed in the country. Yevgeny Prigozhin was the Kremlin confidant before he turned his troops on Russia's capital. That is, before Putin, who accused Prigozhin of treason. He ordered troops to Ukraine. The Wagner boss dispatched fighters from his private force to conflicts in West Asia and in Africa. However, he has always denied any kind of involvement. And that changed last year when he announced himself as the Wagner founder. Yevgeny Prigozhin that we're talking about here. And he also began a mass recruitment drive at Russia's prisons for foot soldiers to fight in exchange for an amnesty. Now, Prigozhin was locked in a bitter months-long power struggle with the defense ministry as his ragtag forces spearheaded the costly battles for limited gains in eastern Ukraine. He began blasting what he said was systemic mismanagement and lying in the Russian defense ministry. Now, he had earlier accused the Russian military of trying to steal victories from Wagner, and he accused the Moscow bureaucracy of not following the orders. Meanwhile, let's also tell you that in June, Prigozhin ordered his private fighting group to unseat Russia's top brass in Moscow. His forces captured key military headquarters in the city of Rostov-on-Don in southern Russia before setting their course for Moscow, where the authorities beefed up security in anticipation of a showdown. Now, the evil that the military leadership of the country brings must be stopped. Prigozhin announced after claiming the defense ministry had launched strikes on the Wagner bases. The aborted bid ended with Putin ultimately offering exile to Prigozhin in neighboring Belarus, to the mutineers, and also Prigozhin, like I just mentioned. In July, a video on Telegram channels linked to the Wagner mercenary group appeared to show its boss Yevgeny Prigozhin in Belarus. He was seen welcoming fighters and describing developments on the front line in Ukraine as a disgrace. Well, after that, Wagner boss was spotted in Russia during the Africa summit. Prigozhin appeared in a footage as well this week where he said that he will make Africa freer and suggested that he was on the continent. Well, for more on this, we were earlier joined by Peter Kuznick, Professor for History and Director of the Nuclear Studies Institute at American University. We asked him whether the Wagner chief Yevgeny Prigozhin, who has been listed among the 10 people killed in the plane crash north of Moscow, is actually dead. This is what he had to say. Take a listen.
We don't know for sure, and so it's important not to jump to conclusions, but the evidence certainly suggests that Prigozhin was on that plane and he was a victim. We're also picking this up from some of the Wagner sources where they're already mourning Prigozhin as if he's dead. I did an earlier interview today with Russian TV about a totally different subject, about Japan's release of radioactive water around the Fukushima plant. And the people I spoke to there were also, from Russian TV, convinced, based on what they'd heard, that Prigozhin was on board. Assuming that it's almost certain that Prigozhin was a victim of this plane crash, as we think was Dmitry Yutkin, who was the number 2 person in the Wagner group. So it looks like both of the principal leaders of Wagner were very likely killed in this plane crash.
Now, there were already questions on Prigozhin's personal safety after the aborted mutiny. US and Ukraine are already pointing the fingers at Putin here, especially coming just a day after Putin replaced his Air Force chief, the so-called General Armageddon. Listen to what Peter had to say on this.
Speculation around the world is that Putin was very likely behind this. And the reason is that there have been a lot of Putin's opponents who have ended up dead in recent years. So we know that Putin has a lot of control. The assumption in the West is that Putin controls everything that goes on inside Russia. And so the immediate reaction is that Putin was behind this also. But it's sort of like the Kennedy assassination. Kennedy had a lot of enemies, a lot of people who wanted to see him dead. So did Prigozhin. Some Russian leaders have cast shadow on Zelensky and said maybe Ukraine was involved in killing Prigozhin. Well, certainly Ukraine had a motive. Putin, of course, had a motive. Also, Gerasimov had a motive. Shoigu had a motive. Prigozhin had many enemies. So we can assume that Putin very likely was behind this, but we don't know for sure.